Elderly soldier. Rescued a German shepherd. K9 abandoned in the mud. What the dog did to save his life afterward was tragic. He thought he was alone in this world, forgotten by his country, ignored by his neighbors, left to grow old with only the sound of the wind moving through the trees behind his crumbling farmhouse. But one cold morning changed everything. Sergeant Walter Briggs, a 74-year-old retired soldier, was clearing brush near the edge of his land when he saw it, something barely moving, half buried in thick, wet mud. At first, he thought it was debris from the last storm, but as he stepped closer, the shape lifted its head just slightly, and he saw the pain in its eyes. It was a German shepherd, a K9, skin and bone, covered in filth. Someone had abandoned him like trash. Without a second thought, Walter dropped to his knees, ignoring the scream in his joints, and pulled the dog from the mud with shaking hands. The moment their eyes met, something passed between them, an unspoken recognition. They were both survivors, both left behind. What happened next would change Walter's life forever, because weeks later, when Walter collapsed alone in his home, that same dog, the one no one believed in, did something no one could have expected. And it saved Walter's life in the most heartbreaking way. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more powerful and emotional stories like this to you. Now, let me tell you how a forgotten dog and a forgotten man found each other in the mud, and how love, even in silence, can save a life. The morning air was thick with fog when Sergeant Walter Briggs stepped onto his back porch. The November wind had blown in overnight, covering his small patch of land in a layer of cold dew. His knees cracked as he descended the steps, shovel in one hand, a worn thermos of coffee in the other. Walter had lived alone for years, ever since his wife passed, and the army called him too old to serve. The medals on his wall didn't mean much anymore. The world had moved on, but he still woke up before dawn, still made his coffee black, and still walked the edge of his property like he was on patrol. Old habits die hard. He was halfway through clearing some storm-downed branches near the back fence when he heard it, faint, almost like a wheeze. He stopped, listened. There it was again, a soft whimper, barely above the rustling leaves. Walter followed the sound through the underbrush until his boots met with slick, cold mud. That's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a wounded deer, but then the shape shifted, just slightly, and he caught a glimpse of pointed ears and dull, matted fur. A dog. No, a German shepherd. Big, though now sunken from hunger and stuck, buried almost to the chest in sludge and vines. Walter dropped his tools and stumbled forward. "Hey there, buddy," he whispered, approaching slowly. "It's okay. It's okay now." The shepherd didn't growl, didn't fight. He just looked up with golden eyes that shimmered with a quiet, hopeless pain. As Walter reached out, the dog whimpered, but didn't pull away. It took every bit of strength Walter had to dig the mud loose with his hands. His fingers went numb, his coat soaked through, but after 10 minutes, the dog was free. He collapsed into Walter's arms, too weak to stand. Walter wrapped him in his flannel jacket and carried him back up to the house. Inside, he cleaned the dog gently, whispering soft commands the way he used to with his men. "You're gonna be all right, soldier. Just hang on." The dog had no collar, no ID, but Walter knew a military dog when he saw one. The body language, the silent gaze, the scars. Someone had worked this dog to the bone, then dumped him like he was nothing. Walter placed a blanket on the floor next to the fireplace and laid the shepherd down. He heated broth on the stove, spooning it slowly into the dog's mouth. The dog didn't resist. He drank. Hours passed. Walter stayed by his side the entire time. He named him Shadow, not just because of his color, but because of the way he followed silently, always watching. That night, Walter slept on the floor beside him. The next morning, Shadow stirred, slowly but with strength returning. He raised his head and nuzzled Walter's leg. "Welcome back." Walter smiled. Over the next week, their bond deepened. Walter found joy again, purpose. He laughed when Shadow chased birds in the yard, barked at squirrels, or sat stoically at the window like a sentry. They were two old souls, sharing the same space, the same quiet. Walter started talking again, really talking. Not to the empty walls, but to Shadow. He told him about the war, about losing Clara, about the son who moved away and never called, about the dreams that still haunted him. And Shadow listened, always listened. One night, Walter lit a fire and sat in his recliner, watching the flames dance. Shadow was curled at his feet, one ear always perked. "You saved me, you know," Walter whispered. "I thought I was rescuing you, but maybe it was the other way around." Shadow lifted his head and rested it on Walter's foot. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, an old man and an abandoned K9 found something rare: peace. They didn't know it yet, but this bond would soon be tested in the most devastating way, and only one of them would have the strength to act when the moment came. The days that followed brought unexpected warmth into Walter Briggs' life, a light he hadn't felt in years. Shadow, the German shepherd once stuck in the mud and nearly lifeless, now followed Walter like a loyal shadow, true to his name. Wherever Walter went, Shadow was there. Whether it was gathering firewood, sitting on the porch in the quiet mornings, or limping around the dusty living room as old jazz records crackled on the stereo. They didn't need many words between them. That was the beauty of their bond. Walter had spent most of his life barking orders or biting his tongue, but Shadow understood everything without a sound. There was a kind of healing happening that neither of them spoke about, but both of them felt. One morning, Walter was filling Shadow's bowl when he heard tires crunching up the gravel road. That was rare. He lived so far off the beaten path that even delivery drivers turned around halfway. But today, a sleek black truck rolled into the clearing, and a man stepped out. Tall, clean-cut, early 30s. "Sergeant Briggs?" he called, holding a clipboard. Walter stepped onto the porch. Shadow was already at his side, ears high. "Depends who's asking," Walter replied, hand on the old railing. "I'm with the Veterans Outreach Office." "You haven't returned our calls," the man said, flipping a page. "We've been trying to reach you. You missed your last 2 physicals, and there's a new home assistance program for retired service members. We'd like to—" "I don't need help," Walter said flatly. The man looked at Shadow and nodded slowly. "That your dog?" "He is." "He's marked," the man said, crouching slightly. "Looks like a retired K9. See that tattoo on his right ear? That's government issue. He probably served like you." Walter raised a brow. "You mean someone left him behind after war?" "Wouldn't be the first," the man said, standing up again. "Budget cuts, injuries. Sometimes they just let them go." Walter's jaw tightened. "They deserve better," he muttered. "Yeah," the man said, "they do." When the truck pulled away, Walter watched it disappear into the trees, Shadow still by his side. The dog's eyes followed the trail long after the dust settled. Maybe he remembered something. Maybe not. But Walter knew one thing for sure. Shadow would never be discarded again. That night, the wind howled harder than usual, shaking the old farmhouse. Walter lit the fireplace, placed a blanket down for Shadow, and sat with a book he couldn't bring himself to read. Instead, he watched Shadow breathe, rising and falling in rhythm like a gentle tide. His thoughts drifted to the past, to men who never came home, to nights spent under enemy fire, to waking up screaming, even decades later. Shadow opened his eyes and looked at him. I still get 'em, Walter admitted aloud. The dreams. Shadow rested his chin on Walter's boot. You're the first thing in a long time that makes 'em stop. For the first time in years, Walter fell asleep without fear. But the next day, something changed. While walking back from the barn, Walter staggered. Just one step. But Shadow noticed. Walter grabbed his chest, coughed, and dismissed it with a shake of his head. I'm fine, boy, he muttered. Shadow didn't move. He stared. Alert. Tense. Like he knew. By nightfall, the color in Walter's face was off. He moved slower, sat down more. Shadow refused to leave his side, not even for food. Walter brushed him off with a chuckle. You're acting like a nurse, he said, but Shadow's eyes told a different story. That night, as Walter leaned back into his chair with a cup of tea, the mug slipped from his hands and shattered on the floor. His breath hitched. A sharp pain seized his chest. Shadow barked once, sharp, urgent. Walter's hand trembled as he reached for the armrest. I think, he wheezed. Then silence. Shadow lunged toward the front door, pawing it frantically. He barked louder, panicked, then raced to the landline mounted on the kitchen wall. He leapt, again and again, his paws slamming into the emergency button Walter had installed years ago, but never used. On the third jump, the button clicked. A dispatcher's voice crackled through. 911, what's your emergency? All they could hear was a dog barking. Desperate, relentless. Then, the call cut. But it was enough. It would take 10 more minutes for help to arrive. 10 minutes. Shadow refused to leave Walter's side. The old soldier lay still, eyes closed. And the dog waited, watching, guarding. The minutes stretched like hours. Shadow lay pressed against Walter's chest, his ears twitching at every distant sound. His body was still, but his eyes were wide, alert, refusing to blink. The warmth was fading from Walter's skin, and the steady rise and fall of his breathing had grown shallow. Too shallow. Shadow whined, then barked once. No response. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. Inside, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting soft, flickering light across the old photographs on the mantel. Walter in uniform. Walter and Clara on their wedding day. Walter holding a newborn in his arms, smiling like the world hadn't broken him yet. Shadow looked around. He paced. He barked again, louder this time, standing guard over the man who had saved him. The one who had dragged him from the mud, fed him broth with a spoon, and let him sleep beside the fire when he was too weak to lift his own head. He owed Walter his life. And now, Walter needed his. The sirens arrived exactly 9 minutes after the call went through. Red lights painted the trees outside as the ambulance pulled onto the gravel driveway. 2 paramedics jumped out, slamming the doors behind them, rushing to the porch. The front door was unlocked. Shadow had pawed it open earlier, trying to get outside, but refused to leave when Walter had collapsed. The paramedics stepped inside and froze. Shadow stood in front of Walter, growling low. Not in threat, in fear, in defense. "Whoa! Easy, boy," one of them said, raising his hands. "We're here to help." Shadow didn't move. His body was tense, his tail down. But his eyes, they were pleading. "Let us through, okay? We have to help him." The second paramedic slowly crouched, reaching into a pocket and pulling out a granola bar. "Here, bud, it's okay." Shadow stepped forward, sniffed it, then backed away. He didn't need the food. He needed them to understand. Finally, he sat down, looking toward Walter, and let out a single long whine. It was permission. The paramedics moved quickly. Oxygen mask, heart monitor, chest compressions, epinephrine shot. One of them radioed in. Male, 74, cardiac arrest. Pulse is faint, possible myocardial infarction. Shadow watched it all from the corner, not making a sound now, just trembling. After 3 agonizing minutes, one of them looked up and nodded. "We got a rhythm. Let's move." They loaded Walter onto the gurney, rolling him toward the front door. Shadow followed, tail low, ears pinned. When the paramedics tried to close the door, he barked, sharp, determined. The driver looked at the other medic. "What about the dog?" "He called us." "What?" "I'm serious. The landline was triggered by the emergency button. There's no way." "Mandy, Briggs could have reached it from where he fell. The dog must have hit it." The driver glanced at Shadow. "No way he's staying behind." They didn't argue. The back of the ambulance opened again. Shadow leapt inside. He didn't move from Walter's side the entire ride. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Doctors shouted codes, and nurses rushed past with clipboards and carts. But through it all, Shadow sat by the edge of the emergency room doors, refusing to be moved. Staff offered him water, treats, a towel to lie on. He ignored them all. He only looked toward the doors. He stayed that way for 5 hours. Finally, a nurse came through. Young, soft-spoken, with tired eyes. "He's alive," she whispered. "He's asking for you." Shadow rose instantly. Inside room 1007, Walter was pale, hooked to wires and beeping machines, but conscious. Barely. The moment Shadow entered, Walter blinked and tried to smile. "You called them, didn't you?" he murmured, voice thin. Shadow placed his head gently on the edge of the bed. Walter lifted a trembling hand and rested it on the shepherd's neck. "You're a good soldier," he said. Shadow closed his eyes. For a while, neither of them moved. They didn't need to. Back at the farmhouse, the fire had gone out completely. The coffee mug still lay shattered on the floor. But in the hospital room, a bond that began in the mud had just deepened into something stronger than either of them had known. Sacrifice. Loyalty. Life. The heart attack had left him weak, slower than ever, but not defeated. His doctor told him it could have been fatal. Would have been fatal if someone hadn't activated the emergency line in time. Walter didn't say much about it. He just pointed to the corner of the hospital room, where Shadow lay curled up beside his folded coat. "That dog's the reason I'm here," he muttered. "You should be thanking him." Shadow never left. Not once. The nurses were skeptical at first. Hospitals had rules after all. But the attending physician overrode them when he saw Shadow's behavior. Every time Walter's heart monitor beeped too fast, Shadow would perk up. When Walter groaned in pain, Shadow was already on his feet. He didn't need permission to care. The hospital staff started calling him Dr. Dog. On the 3rd night, a nurse named Carla brought Shadow a small tray of chicken breast and rice from the cafeteria. He ate it carefully, his eyes always shifting between bites to make sure Walter was still breathing. That evening, Walter whispered to Carla, "I've outlived most of the men I served with, and this damn dog, he's the first soul that's made me want to stick around a bit longer." Carla smiled. "Well, he's not going anywhere either." But outside that quiet room, the world had taken notice. The emergency dispatcher had filed a report. Dog activated landline emergency button, resulting in life-saving call. A local news channel picked up the story. Then a regional one. Then a national morning show requested a segment. People from all over the country sent letters, donations, care packages. One woman from Vermont wrote, "I lost my husband last year. I thought I'd never feel hope again. But this story reminded me, that even the forgotten still matter." Walter didn't care about the attention. He just wanted to go home. When the day finally came, Walter stepped into the morning light with Shadow trotting proudly beside him. He was slower now, walking with a cane and a portable oxygen unit in his jacket pocket. But his eyes were clearer, brighter. The VA had installed a ramp to the porch while he was gone. Volunteers had come out to fix the broken gate, repaint the fence, and even plant flowers around the house. Walter blinked when he saw it. He hadn't asked for any of it, but maybe, just maybe, he had earned it. Shadow ran ahead into the yard, chasing a butterfly. With a burst of puppy-like energy, Walter chuckled, the sound rough in his throat, but warm. "Guess we're both getting second chances," he said. He settled into his favorite chair on the porch, blanket over his lap. Shadow climbed onto the wooden steps beside him and rested his chin on Walter's boot, eyes half closed, ears twitching. The quiet returned, but this time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt like peace. That night, as a fire crackled in the hearth and the wind pressed against the windows, Walter sat with a thick envelope on the table. Inside were forms. A formal request to adopt Shadow, now classified as a retired military working dog. He signed it without hesitation. Then he leaned over and scratched behind Shadow's ears. "You're family now, officially." Shadow licked his hand once, then laid down at Walter's feet. The television buzzed softly in the background, a rerun of the interview Walter had refused to attend. A reporter smiled at the camera, voice cheerful. "This is a story about loyalty, about second chances, and about the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his K9. A reminder to all of us that even in silence, love speaks the loudest." Walter muted the volume. "I don't need them to explain it," he whispered. "I lived it." And as he turned off the lights and locked the door, Shadow followed him to bed, curling up on the floor with one paw touching Walter's slipper. They both slept soundly that night, because for the first time in a long time, neither of them was alone. It was a Wednesday morning when the first knock came. Walter rarely had visitors, especially unannounced. The VA nurse came once a week. The mailman left everything at the gate, and the grocery deliveries were dropped off at the porch. But this knock was different. 3 sharp raps, then silence. Shadow was up before Walter even got to his feet. He stood at the door, tail rigid, ears forward, ready to protect. Walter reached the door slowly, cane in one hand, curiosity rising in his chest. When he opened it, the last thing he expected was 2 men in uniform. Not police, military, U.S. Army dress blues. The younger man stepped forward. "Sergeant Briggs?" Walter straightened up instinctively. "That's me." "I'm Captain Landry. This is Lieutenant Jacobs. We're with the K9 Military Recovery Program. We're here about the dog." Walter didn't respond right away. Shadow stood beside him, silent but alert, as if he understood every word. Captain Landry continued. "That German Shepherd in your care. He was part of a classified unit, K927B. His name was Ranger. He went missing 6 months ago during a stateside training transfer. We had him listed as presumed dead." Walter looked down at Shadow, at Ranger. The dog didn't move, just stared back at the 2 men. "He was dumped," Walter said. "Left to die in the mud." "Yes, sir. That's what we believe too. We're investigating how it happened." Captain Landry paused. "We wanted to thank you. You saved one of ours." Walter's jaw tightened. "He saved me." The officers shared a look. "We'd like to offer him a formal recognition," the lieutenant added. "He deserves to be honored, and, if you're willing, we'd like to invite both of you to a ceremony at Fort Benning. There are other handlers, other soldiers who knew Ranger. It would mean something." Walter's eyes softened. He looked at Shadow, who now sat gallantly beside him, tail tapping once against the floor. "We'll think about it," Walter said quietly. "But he stays with me." "Of course," Captain Landry nodded. "He's yours, permanently. You've more than earned that. They handed him a folder with official documents. Ranger's real name, his service record, medals, injuries, missions. There were photos, too, of a younger, sharper Ranger sitting proudly beside soldiers, eyes always on his handler. Walter took it all in, then looked at the dog beside him, older now, a little slower but with the same fire in his eyes. After the officers left, Walter sat on the porch and opened the folder again. He placed one photo on the table. In it, Ranger was standing beside a young man in fatigues, his original handler. Walter ran a finger over the image. "You were someone's once," he murmured. "You lost them. Like I lost Clara." Shadow Ranger rested his head on Walter's knee. That night, Walter lit a candle beside the photo and whispered a prayer for the handler who never came back, for the dog who did. The following week, they made the trip. Walter wore his own uniform, pressed and spotless, though it hadn't seen sunlight in over a decade. He struggled into it with effort and pride, refusing help until the last button was closed. At Fort Benning, the ceremony was small but deeply personal. They played the national anthem. A chaplain said a few words. Then a general stepped up and placed a medal around Shadow's neck. "For service beyond duty," he said, "and for reminding us that loyalty never retires." Walter stood beside him, hand resting on Shadow's back. He didn't cry. Not then. Not even when they unveiled a bronze peach plaque bearing Shadow's original name and Walter's own beside it, in honor of Ranger and Sergeant Walter Briggs. A bond forged in mud, proven in love. It wasn't until the lights dimmed and they were back home, back on the porch, watching the stars, that Walter allowed himself to whisper, "You were never just a dog. You were a soldier. And now, you're my family." Shadow leaned into him gently, the way he had on the first night. In the silence that followed, nothing more needed to be said. Winter came early that year. The wind carried a bitter bite, and the woods behind Walter's property turned still and gray. But inside the small farmhouse, warmth lived in every corner. Walter and Shadow, no, Ranger, had developed a rhythm that no storm could break. Morning walks became slower, but still sacred. Walter would sip his coffee in the kitchen, while Ranger waited patiently at the door. Ears perked, eyes always scanning the trees like they were still on a mission. "You still got that soldier's instinct," Walter would chuckle, adjusting his coat. "Old habits die harder in dogs, I guess." But even the strongest habits can falter. And one morning, Ranger didn't get up right away. Walter noticed it instantly. The way the dog lifted his head, but didn't stand. So how he shifted awkwardly like his legs betrayed him. "You all right, buddy?" Walter asked softly, kneeling beside him. Ranger licked his hand and tried to rise. He couldn't. Walter's heart clenched. The vet came to the house that afternoon, a kind woman named Dr. Fields, who had treated Ranger once before, after his recovery. She examined him gently, feeling along his spine, listening to his breath. "He's old," she said, her voice low. "And everything he's been through, combat, injury, abandonment, it's taken a toll. His joints are giving out. The neurological signs, they suggest it may be degenerative." Walter looked down at Ranger, who sat between them, panting quietly. "But he's still him," Walter whispered. "Still sharp, still alert." Dr. Fields nodded. "He has good days ahead, but they'll get fewer. When he starts to lose the spark, you'll know." Walter was silent for a long time. "Thank you, Doc," he finally said. "We've still got one last patrol in us." The next few weeks became a journal of borrowed time. Walter canceled his VA appointments, refusing to leave Ranger's side. The walks became short, just to the edge of the porch some mornings, but Walter was there for every step, whispering encouragement like a drill sergeant and a father at once. "You're doing great, Ranger. One more step. That's it." He fed him by hand when his appetite waned. He slept on the floor again when Ranger couldn't make it onto the bed. He retold every story from his past, every deployment, every letter Clara had sent him, every moment of grief and glory, because he didn't want Ranger to feel forgotten. And Ranger listened. He always listened. Then, one night, it happened. Walter awoke to a strange stillness. No panting, no tail thump, no presence beside the bed. He sat up, heart racing, and looked toward the fire. Ranger was lying by it, motionless, his head resting on the old flannel blanket from the night Walter first brought him home. His chest rose, barely. Walter crawled across the floor, hands shaking. "Ranger?" he whispered. The dog's eyes opened slowly, soft, fading. Walter wrapped his arms around him. "It's all right," he whispered. "You did good. You did so good." Ranger blinked once, his breath slowing. "You saved me, boy," Walter said, voice cracking. "You gave me something I thought I'd lost a long time ago." Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like the ghost of a trumpet's call. Ranger let out one final exhale, eyes never leaving Walter's. Then, he was gone. The funeral was small. Just Walter, the flag he'd served under, and a handmade wooden cross by the large oak in the yard. He buried Ranger with full honors, his military medal, his photo, and the flannel blanket that had been theirs since the beginning. As the last shovel of dirt was packed, Walter stood back and saluted. "Rest easy, soldier." A few days later, the mail brought a padded envelope. Inside was a letter from the K9 Military Recovery Program and a second tag. On it was a simple engraving: Ranger, Hero, Brother, Guardian. Walter placed it on a chain and wore it around his neck from that day on. Every morning, Walter still walks to that oak tree, sometimes with his cane, sometimes with his hands in his coat pockets. He talks to Ranger out loud like he's still there, because in many ways, he is. And on his porch, carved into the old wood beam above the door, are the words Walter etched himself with his army knife the day after Ranger passed. "A dog saved my life, and I will never forget his." If this story touched your heart, remember this: heroes don't always wear uniforms. Some come with paws and scars and eyes that never stop watching. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in second chances, silent loyalty, and love that never dies.